When you think of neutral countries in World War II, the first ones that probably come to mind are the three S's: Spain, Sweden, and of course, Switzerland. But while this war engulfed most of the world, we often forget that one more country managed to avoid the catastrophe that surrounded its neighbors: Turkey. Okay, technically they did declare war a couple of months before the fall of Berlin, just so they could say they contributed. But they never actually sent a single soldier to contribute. How was that even possible? How did they manage to stay out of the conflict even though they were pressured by the Germans, the Soviets, the British, and the Americans? The first thing you need to understand is Turkey's point of view. Ankara didn't want a war. After a long period of Ottoman decline, Turkey was exhausted. Just from 1911 to 1920, they had a war with Italy, which they lost, then the Balkan War twice, which they lost twice, then World War I, which they also lost, and after that they had a war where they were attacked by Greece, France, Britain, Italy, and Armenia. So they went from this to this. Not exactly a blow-up. Luckily for them, Ataturk came to power, abolished the Sultanate, declared the Constitutional Republic, and liberated the territory of modern-day Turkey. After the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, Turkey looked like this. But the new republic was drained from all the warfare and had no ambitions to expand. Instead, it adopted a position of neutrality and turned inwards, focusing on industrialization and modernization, following the example of Western Europe. Yet, all of Ataturk's reforms needed time to actually start making a noticeable difference, which meant that by the time World War II started, the country was still lagging behind the West, not just economically, but militarily too. They had 174,000 soldiers, 20,000 officers, and not nearly enough equipment. What they did have was mostly World War I level gear. They lacked warplanes, and even the few that they did have were old. They didn't have enough pilots, and they didn't have enough mechanics. Their navy was also pretty terrible. So yeah, they weren't exactly thrilled about the idea of joining a war. So they more or less tried to mind their own business, which is kind of what I try to do online myself. Just mind my own business. That's why I use private internet access, a VPN that keeps my digital life out of the global mess, just like Turkey in World War II. PIA hides your IP, encrypts your connection, and lets you change your virtual location to over 90 countries since they've got over 10,000 servers. Whether I'm working from a cafe in Saigon or watching US-based Netflix from Serbia, nobody's spying or blocking me. You can protect an unlimited number of devices with just one account, and they have a strict no-logs policy that's been proven in court. Use my link piavpn.com/historyandbeyond and get 83% off, which comes out to just $2.03 every month. And plus you get 4 months extra for free. It's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thanks to PIA for sponsoring the video. Now back to the trenches. So they more or less tried to mind their own business. Still, much easier said than done, as the world around them was descending into chaos. Why? Well, mostly because the first Hearts of Iron wouldn't come out for another 65 years, meaning the painter, Stalin, and Mussolini couldn't just take their frustrations out in a video game like any normal 14-year-old. Luckily, Turkey would be guided through all this by the steady hand of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who died less than a year before the start of World War II. He was succeeded by Mustafa İsmet İnönü, whose job was to fill Ataturk's very large shoes and try to continue modernizing the country while also steering it through a world war without losing Turkish lives. The problem was, both the British and the Germans were now pressuring Ankara to join their side. The British, for example, were offering Turkey loans to help develop its industry and buy weapons on the condition that they wouldn't side with Germany. Turkey actually leaned more towards London and Paris anyway, mostly because Germany's alliance with Italy made them nervous. Why? Well, because Mussolini loved role-playing the Caesar and wanted to control the Mediterranean Sea, Mare Nostrum. It was especially scary since Italy already held islands in the Aegean Sea just a few kilometers off the coast of Turkey. And you know, they had trust issues from the past. So yeah, Turkey leaned towards Britain because they didn't like the Italians. They also feared the Soviets, who had their eyes on the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. In any case, Ankara wasn't in a position to experiment with the war. It had neither the money nor the army for such an endeavor. Even with the British loans, it wasn't enough to bring a meaningful change. So they also traded with Germany, which actually made up the bulk of their foreign trade. In fact, Germany was offering way more money for Turkish goods, trying to make Ankara economically dependent on Berlin, maybe even keep them from siding with the Allies. Keep in mind that Britain and France did want Turkey on their side, but they were also worried that such a move might provoke Italy and Germany. Still, after Italy invaded Albania in April 1939 and the Germans and the Soviets split Poland in October of the same year, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the guy who gifted Czechoslovakia to the painter, finally realized that the Masterschman and his friend might not actually stop expanding. And since Germany was trading so heavily with Turkey, they feared Berlin might sway Ankara. So in October October 1939, Chamberlain offered Turkey a mutual defense pact, bringing in the French as well. Under this pact, Turkey agreed to go to war, but only if the war extended into the Mediterranean. In return, they would guarantee help if attacked by Italy or Germany. A key clause was that Turkey wasn't required to help Britain or France. If doing so would put them at war with the Soviet Union. Inoni also hoped to secure a similar pact with the Soviets. One small issue, Moscow still insisted on the access to the Dardanelles, which terrified the Turks, especially since the Soviets had signed the pact with the Germans and helped split Poland, so Turkey feared they'd share the same fate. Also, Turkey wasn't exactly ecstatic about their deal with London and Paris either, because even if Britain and France promised to help, could they really support Turkey with the weapons it needed, especially as the war was heating up? One Turkish general estimated that what they needed to properly equip the army would cost around 10 billion pounds today, which Britain simply couldn't deliver. So could they actually be trusted to help Turkey if needed? I mean, just look at what happened to Poland. Britain had a pact with them too. And also, Turkey's whole attitude towards the war was along the lines of, sounds like a you problem, because Turkey simply wasn't as close to the action as Poland or Yugoslavia. They didn't want their soldiers dying in a faraway conflict between the great powers. Or as the Turkish foreign minister proudly said, we are egoists and fight exclusively for ourselves. They just weren't keen on going to war. They just wanted to ensure no one attacked them. Of course, by the end of 1939, they had plenty of opportunities to realize that non-aggression pacts were worth about as much as the German mark in the 30s. But they still figured this was the best they could do. That's why they, among other things, kept friendly ties with Berlin, who they did most of their trading with anyways. They simply didn't have the gear nor the manpower for any kind of conflict. Plus the Germans paid well. Anyways, Germany blitzed through France in June 1940, which raised a few eyebrows in Turkey. They were worried that they chose the wrong side of the war again. Also, at the same time, Italy joined the war on June 10th, 1940, which meant Turkey was technically obliged to help Britain and France since the war had reached the Mediterranean. But how do you help France when France doesn't even exist? At least that's how Inoni justified it, even though France technically held on for another 10 days. So yeah, Turkey didn't stand by the deal because to them, France was already past tense. By April 1941, there was a pro-German coup in Iraq, though it lasted for a very short time because the Brits got Iraq back. But at the same time, Syria was also under the control of Vichy France, which was also pro-German, while the entire Balkans were occupied by the Axis powers. And as the Soviets were still working with the Nazis, declaring war on Italy now didn't seem like the smartest move. And here's the thing, as long as Turkey stayed neutral, as long as it didn't fall under Axis control or let Axis troops pass through, it was actually useful to the Allies, because it helped block the Axis access to rich, oil-rich regions of Azerbaijan and Iraq. You have to understand, one of Hitler's biggest obstacles for achieving his megalomaniac dreams was the lack of oil, maybe even the biggest obstacle, an obstacle that could be solved by conquering the Caucasus and Iraq. The painter had two options, go through Turkey or attack the Soviet Union. Now, I know the choice may seem obvious, but the USSR had way more resources. Oh yeah, and the painter dramatically underestimated Moscow. Besides oil, Germany was also running low on food, so he figured that Ukraine's endless wheat fields plus a generous batch of Slavic slaves would fill in the gaps nicely. Still, if Germany could reach friendly Iraq without firing a single shot, they would definitely go for it. Once they secured that front, they could hit the Soviets. That's why they asked Ankara to let German troops pass through. But Turkey demanded parts of Iraq in return. And while they were haggling, the British took the opportunity to retake Iraq. By July 1941, they had also liberated Lebanon and Syria too. So the problem of allowing Germans to pass through Turkey kinda got resolved by itself. But the nervous Turks rushed to sign a friendship pact with Germany on June 18th, 1941. However, the painter still needed his precious oil and food, so he came up with this brilliant idea to attack the Soviet Union, and thus began the infamous Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, which now put the Soviets on the side of the Allies, which makes things for Ankara slightly more interesting. You have to keep in mind that Turkey and Germany did a lot of business together. Not long after Barbarossa kicked off, the Turks signed a deal to supply the Germans with chromite, a crucial ingredient for making high-quality steel. By 1943, Germany was getting nearly 100% of it straight from Turkey. That's why they were paying the Turks way over its market value just to stop the Turks from selling it to the Allies. The Turks still sold it to the Allies. But this sitting on two chairs at the same time thing was really starting to annoy both sides, especially since the British PM, Winston Churchill, wanted to attack the Axis through the Balkans, and for that, he would need Turkey's help. However, the US President, Franklin Roosevelt, wasn't on board because he didn't want to open yet another front. He also didn't want Britain gaining too much influence in the Balkans. Yeah, you heard that correctly. There was strong competition in the region between the two allies. Long story, just remember that detail. However, that's exactly why the Soviets were totally on board with the American stance, because they too didn't want Western powers expanding their influence on the Balkans, though London and Moscow would haggle over the regions in the percentages agreement. So Churchill eventually came to terms with the fact that the Balkan plan was a no-go. However, the Balkans maybe weren't exactly as important anymore. The Soviets had already turned to the side of the war by 1944, and the Brits and the Americans were deep into Italy. The Allies realized that Turkey just wasn't as crucial anymore. In fact, they straight up warned the Turks that if they don't stop trading with the Germans, the Allies would stop sending them aid. And not only that, if Stalin suddenly decides he wants to go shopping for a few chunks of Turkey, which, let's be honest, he'd already been eyeing, the Allies would just kind of looked the other way. That was the final wake-up call for Inoni. Germany was losing, Allied pressure was growing, and the cost of ending up on the wrong side of history again was just too high. So Turkey stopped trading with Germany in April 1944, and by August they officially cut ties. Soon after, the Allies issued an ultimatum stating that if Turkey didn't declare war on Germany by March 1st, 1945, they wouldn't get a seat in the soon-to-be formed United Nations. Not wanting to be excluded from the international community, the Republic declared war on Germany and also Japan just 1 week before the deadline. So yeah, technically Turkey wasn't neutral, but they never actually sent a single soldier into combat. Maybe the most important reason why Turkey could stay neutral was geography. Turkey had the advantage of being in a much more favorable position than Poland, which was basically squashed between two giants just waiting to devour it. At the end of the war, Turkey was still pretty far away from Germany, and to the south it bordered colonies of friendly nations. The Soviets definitely were a real threat, but still, Turkey wasn't stuck between two hostile armies. So considering the country was economically wrecked after decades of non-stop warfare, had a small and outdated military, and wasn't exactly dreaming of expansion, but just wanted to focus on recovery, staying neutral was the only move that made sense for Inoni's government. And since they weren't geographically cursed like Poland or Yugoslavia, and thanks to some skilled diplomacy, Turkey managed to walk the tightrope between two warring sides for 6 whole years. And came out the other end without a scratch. But something that shouldn't stay without a scratch are the like, share and subscribe buttons. See you all in the next one, good people. Pozdrav!